At my sister's graduation party, my name tag read, "The Problem Child." My mom smirked, always straight to the point. I leaned in, toasted the room, and said, "This is the last time I'll be around to hear this." They thought it was a joke, until I turned and left with one shocking goodbye. Hi Reddit. I'm Eva 40F, and I guess you could say this story has been a long time coming. I've told pieces of it to close friends over the years, usually when someone shares a rough holiday story or vents about their in-laws. But I've never told the full version, not like this. It's about family, labels, and what happens when someone decides not to keep playing their assigned role anymore. I'll start by painting a bit of a picture. I grew up in a town so small you couldn't sneeze in public without 3 people calling your mother to check on you. You know the kind: one stoplight, a family diner with a handwritten pie menu, and the same kids in your class from kindergarten through high school. My parents, Tom and Leanne, were what you'd call known. Dad ran a general contracting business that had his name on every truck in town, and Mom was a presence. She was on the PDA before any of us were old enough for school. Organized charity galas, hosted book clubs, made gift baskets for every new family on our street. She was good at being seen, and she wanted her family to be just as good at it. There were 3 of us. I'm the oldest, then my brother Nolan, now 37M, and my little sister Brynn, 22F. Yep, that's an 18-year age gap between me and Brynn. She was the unexpected baby, the miracle child. My mother used to say Brynn gave her motherhood a second chance. I used to think that was just a sweet sentiment. Over time, I realized it was code for something else entirely. From the outside, we looked like a picture-perfect family. Our holiday cards had matching sweaters and golden retrievers. We had the framed portraits in the hallway, the yearly beach trip photos, the formal dining room no one used except when guests came over. But inside those walls, it felt different. Growing up, I never really knew what version of my mother I was going to get. Some days, she was warm and generous, making pancakes shaped like animals and tucking notes into her lunchboxes. Other days, she'd scold me for the tone in my voice, or the way I walked into her room, or for asking too many questions. She had a way of making me feel like I was always one misstep away from being too much. Too opinionated, too sarcastic, too sensitive, too loud. Even when I tried to shrink myself, I was somehow still too much. My brother Nolan, on the other hand, was laid back and charming. He coasted through most of his teenage years on a wave of smiles and boys will be boys. He got caught sneaking out once and ended up with extra dessert. I once stayed up too late reading under the covers and got grounded for deceitfulness. But even Nolan, for all his charm, wasn't the favorite. That title belonged to Brynn from the moment she was born. Don't get me wrong, I love my sister. I really do. I held her as a baby, helped her with school projects when I visited home from college, even sent her care packages when she started university. She's smart and funny, and when it's just the 2 of us, she's capable of real warmth. But the version of Brynn that exists in our parents' eyes? That version was spotless, untouchable. Everything she did was extraordinary. When she took her first steps, there were balloons. When she got her learner's permit, Mom threw a small luncheon. I wish I were joking. There were printed invitations and a sheet cake that said, "The road is yours." As we all got older, the distance between me and the rest of the family widened. I moved out early, took a scholarship in another state, and built a quiet little life that, while fulfilling, never quite fit into the family scrapbook. My mom always seemed to find ways to point that out. "Oh, Eva lives in Michigan now. Just her and that scruffy dog of hers," she'd say at reunions, as though it was a tragic story she was trying to soften for the audience. One time, she even told a neighbor I was still finding myself, which is code for doesn't have a husband or children and refuses to come home for Easter. Still, I made an effort. I called on birthdays. I sent Christmas cards. I showed up when it mattered, or at least when I thought it mattered. That brings us to last spring, Brynn's graduation from university. She finished with honors and had a whole line of cords around her neck at the ceremony. I was proud of her. Genuinely. I hadn't seen her in almost a year, and when she reached out and personally asked me to come to her graduation party, I paused. Part of me wanted to decline. Things had been strained with my parents for a long time, and the idea of going back into that world, even for a weekend, made something tighten in my chest. But Brynn had called me, not texted. She said she wanted the whole family there. Just once. So I booked the flight. When I arrived at the venue that day, I wasn't surprised to see how extravagant it all was. My mom had rented out the old town bank, which had been turned into an event space. Vaulted ceilings, polished stone floors, strings of fairy lights across the mezzanine. It looked like something out of a magazine. There were printed menus on every table, a live cellist, a photo booth, a slideshow of Brynn's life playing on loop across two mounted screens, first steps, prom, graduation cap toss. I knew I wouldn't be in many of the photos. I had expected that. What I hadn't expected was the name tag. There was a table by the entrance with a white linen cloth and a woman standing behind it with a clipboard. Guests were checking in, taking their place cards, and grabbing their tags. Each one had the person's name in bold and a little title underneath. Aunt Clara, family chef. Nolan, big brother. Sam, Brynn's favorite teacher. Mine? It read, Eva, the problem child. I stared at it, thinking surely it was a mistake. A typo. A prank? I looked at the woman handing them out. She smiled and said, your mother said you'd get the joke. Behind me, I heard a familiar voice. Cool, crisp, just loud enough to cut through the buzz of conversation. Oh good, you found yours. Always straight to the point, right? It was my mother, Leanne, dressed in soft blue with a necklace I hadn't seen before and the same poised expression she wore in every Christmas card photo. Her tone was light, amused, like we were sharing an inside joke. I didn't laugh. She took a sip from her glass and added, well, it's not inaccurate. I picked up the name tag. It felt heavier than it should have. For a moment, I thought about turning around and walking out, just setting it down and slipping out before anyone noticed. But I didn't. I peeled the backing off and stuck it to my chest. And then I walked inside. The conversation swirled around me, light and familiar, like nothing unusual had happened. A few people glanced at my tag and gave that awkward half-laugh people do when they're not sure if they should laugh harder or pretend they didn't see it. My cousin Bree raised her eyebrows but said nothing. Nolan clapped me on the back and said, hey, at least they didn't put rebellious face. I smiled. Small. Tight. I didn't respond. Brynn came over and hugged me. She looked genuinely happy to see me, which only made everything harder to process. She leaned in and whispered, Mom thought it would be funny. Please don't be mad. Just be here, okay? I nodded, but in the back of my mind, something had started to shift. A quiet, steady thing. Not rage. Not sadness. Just clarity. And it was that feeling, that quiet shift, that led me to stand up later in the evening, to tap my glass, to raise it to the room. I didn't plan to make a toast. Not really. I hadn't written anything down. I hadn't practiced a speech in my hotel mirror or imagined how I'd stand with my glass raised like I belonged up there. I'd just come to be present for my sister, maybe smile politely through a few awkward conversations, then leave early and decompress on the flight home. But something shifted after I walked in wearing that name tag. After the greetings and the obligatory family photos. After I saw how casually everyone accepted what I was labeled, like it was a long-running gag instead of the latest in a long line of subtle humiliations. By the time dinner rolled around, I wasn't angry. That would have been easier. I just felt hollow. Like I wasn't really in my own body, just watching from a few feet above. The food was being served in courses, because of course it was. Brynn had changed into a second outfit. My mother flitted from table to table, placing her hands on shoulders, leaning down to whisper warm nothings into ears, smiling like a hostess from a lifestyle magazine. Dad followed behind her, nodding, occasionally chuckling at things no one else seemed to find funny. Nolan had a crowd around him, telling stories I'd heard a dozen times but somehow got more polished every year. And me? I sat near the end of one of the longer tables, between an uncle I barely knew and a woman who kept referring to me as the author, like I was an exotic animal. Across from me was a centerpiece so large I couldn't see the people on the other side of it. I picked up my salad and watched the slideshow loop around again. It lingered on a photo of Brynn at the beach, around age 10. I was in the background of that one, slightly out of frame, holding a towel and looking straight at the camera. That photo stayed up longer than most. I watched people notice it, watched them not comment, and I thought, this is it. This is the version of me they've settled on. The story they've decided to tell. The problem child. The background figure. The older sister who had the decency to fade out of focus. I looked around the room and realized something quietly devastating. They were comfortable with that version of me. They liked her. She was easy to understand. Predictable. A convenient footnote to Brynn's perfect story. So when the music lowered and the room began to quiet, when the dessert plates were being cleared and someone near the head of the room clinked their fork against a glass, I felt my heart start to drum. Brynn stood and gave her thank you speech. She did well, funny, sweet, gracious. She gave credit to her mentors, her professors, even her older siblings. She thanked mom and dad, of course, with the kind of careful phrasing that sounded warm but measured. And when she finished, when the applause started and people settled back into their chairs, I stood. I hadn't expected to. I don't even remember fully deciding to do it. But I stood, picked up my glass of sparkling cider, and tapped the edge with a spoon. The sound rang out more sharply than I expected. The room quieted slowly, like it wasn't sure whether it was supposed to. And then my mother saw me. She turned from the small circle of town council friends she'd been chatting with and tilted her head just slightly. I recognized that look. It was the look she gave when something unexpected was happening and she hadn't yet decided whether it was a threat or an opportunity. "May I said, gesturing lightly to Brynn. "Just a minute." Brynn smiled, genuine, unsure. "Of course." I cleared my throat, took a breath. My heart was fluttering like bird wings under my ribs, but I kept my face steady, neutral. "I wasn't planning to speak tonight," I began. "I thought I'd let others do the toasts, take the photos, tell the stories. That's what I've usually done at these things." A few people chuckled, though they weren't sure if they were supposed to. But when I saw my name tag at the front, what was it again? I looked down and tapped it lightly with my fingertip. Right. The problem child. I figured maybe I'd lean into the role. Just this once. The room had gone still. A few people laughed again, nervously, this time. I didn't smile. "I think most of you know me. Or at least, you know about me. I'm Eva. I'm Brynn's older sister. Nolan's too. I grew up in this town, went to this high school, sat at some of your kitchen tables for sleepovers and study groups. But it's been a long time since I've been in a room like this. A room where so many of you are in the same place." I paused, and I think I've finally figured out why. My father had stopped chewing. My mother hadn't moved. Not even a sip from her glass. Her face was perfectly composed, but her shoulders were a fraction stiffer than they had been a moment earlier. I continued. "You see, when I left home at 18, it wasn't in some dramatic blaze. There were no slam doors, no shouting matches. I just left. And over the years, I stayed away. But I called. I sent gifts. I reached out. I showed up when it mattered, though maybe not always in the ways you all expected." I looked around the room. Several eyes darted away. And slowly, the version of me that stuck was the one you see right here. I tapped the tag again. The difficult one. The sensitive one. The one who didn't settle down nearby or come home for every birthday. The one who became easy to sum up with a label. I heard someone shift in their seat. A spoon clinked against a dish. Otherwise, silence. And that's fine. You're allowed to see me however you choose. But what I want you to know, what I want to be clear about, is that the person you labeled as the problem was the one who spent years learning how to unlearn what this family taught her about love. Now the quiet had weight to it, like a storm gathering behind the windows. I wasn't raising my voice. I wasn't making a scene. I was simply stating facts. "And I'm not saying this to ruin a party," I said softly. "Brynn, you've done something worth celebrating. I'm proud of you." I turned to look at her then. Her eyes were wide. She looked more like the kid who used to crawl into my bed when thunderstorms scared her than the polished graduate in her second gown. "But I need to say something for myself before I leave." I turned back to the room. "This is the last time I'll be around to hear this version of the story. The one where I'm the punchline. The cautionary tale. The problem? Because it's not my story anymore. And I won't sit in a room where everyone's laughing at a joke I've already outgrown." There was a long pause after I finished. Not the kind of pause people give before a polite applause. Not the pause of surprise or even discomfort. It was something else, thick, unsettled, like the whole room had shifted its weight at once but hadn't quite figured out where to land. I let the silence hang there for a moment. Then, slowly, I set my glass down, adjusted the name tag on my chest, the problem child, and stepped away from the center of the room. My mother's face hadn't changed. Still poised. Still blank. But her hands were clenched in her lap, just tightly enough for me to notice. I caught my father's eye. He looked almost confused, like he wasn't sure if what I'd said was rude or just unfamiliar. Nolan, across the room, opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it. That was fine. I wasn't waiting for a response. I walked back to my seat, not because I intended to stay, but because I had one more thing to do. Something I'd planned weeks ago, though I didn't realize it at the time. You see, I hadn't come empty-handed. Inside my tote bag under the table, tucked beside my wallet and phone, was a simple white envelope. Nothing fancy. Just my name written in my own handwriting. I brought it for Brynn, originally as a quiet, personal gift. A letter I'd written a week before the party. At the time, it had been meant as a kind of olive branch. Something kind, thoughtful. A private message of love and reflection from the sister who hadn't always been easy to understand. But after what I'd walked into, after that name tag, and the way Mom smirked when she said it, and how no one batted an eye, the meaning of the envelope had changed. I took it from my bag, stood again, and walked it over to Brynn. She looked up at me, stunned into silence. Her eyes had gone a bit glassy, but her expression held something else too, uncertainty, maybe even fear. Not fear of me, but fear of what might come next. I handed her the envelope. "This is for you," I said quietly. She looked at it, then at me. "What is it?" "It's not what you think." I didn't wait for her to open it. I turned to the room, to all the people who had known me once and decided they were done trying. And I said, calmly, clearly, this was never going to be just a party. It's a performance. And I won't be part of it anymore. I started toward the door. That's when my mother stood. "Eva," she said, just loud enough to cut through the noise of the room. "If this is your way of making a scene," I stopped. Slowly, I turned. "I didn't make a scene," I replied. "You did. The moment you decided to reduce me to a joke on a sticker." Her eyes narrowed. "Oh, don't be dramatic. You've always been sensitive. You could have laughed like everyone else." I tilted my head. That's exactly the problem. Everyone else laughed. There were murmurs now. People shifting in their chairs, watching like they weren't sure whether to intervene or let the show play out. I recognized that energy. The kind people have when they're watching a slow collision and are just grateful it isn't happening to them. I continued walking toward the exit, and as I reached the doors, I turned back one last time. "I won't be coming back," I said. "Not for holidays. Not for birthdays. Not for special occasions. And before anyone thinks I'll change my mind after a few months, check your inboxes tomorrow." I've made sure there's no confusion. I left. What they didn't know, what they still didn't know, was that I hadn't come for revenge in the traditional sense. I didn't want shouting matches or tears. I didn't want to storm out with a dramatic slam of the door. I wanted them to feel what I'd felt for years, the quiet disorientation of being excluded in plain sight. The realization that someone they thought would always be there was done waiting for them to treat her like she mattered. And I had planned ahead. That letter I gave Brynn? It wasn't just a letter. It was the opening move in something bigger, something measured, surgical. I had spent the last 6 months quietly preparing the rest. I walked to my car, slipped behind the wheel, took a deep breath, and as I turned the ignition, I allowed myself a small smile. Because by the time they opened their email the next morning, they'd all realized something they never saw coming. The morning after the party, I woke earlier than usual, the house still quiet as the sun barely touched the horizon. I lay in bed for a long moment, my mind running through everything I'd said and done the night before, the weight of what was coming next settling over me like a slow tide. Because I knew my family wouldn't just ignore what I'd said. And I had made sure of that. The letter I'd handed Brynn was just a quiet gesture, a way to reach out, to plant a seed of honesty with my sister before everything else unfolded. But the real message, the one I'd spent months preparing, was already out there. In the email waiting for them all, patiently sitting in inboxes across the town. I didn't rush to check my phone. Instead, I spent that morning walking through my small apartment, sipping tea and watching the sunlight brighten the walls. When I finally did look, the responses were already starting to come in. My mother's reply was the first. It was carefully worded, polite but guarded. She spoke of disappointment and family privacy, clearly upset that I'd chosen to air grievances so publicly. But nowhere did she deny the facts, the emails, the messages, the pictures I'd included, and that silence felt like an admission all on its own. Dad's email was brief, almost dismissive, apologizing for any misunderstandings, but quickly shifting blame onto my supposed sensitivity. I could practically hear the same tone he'd used my whole life. Minimize, redirect, avoid. Nolan's message was different. It was long and full of regret. He admitted to being too caught up in his own life to see what was happening to me. He said he wished he'd done more to support me and wanted to rebuild what we'd lost. For the first time in years, I felt like maybe I had a brother again, not just someone who shared my last name. Brynn didn't reply at all. That silence was a wound I hadn't anticipated. The sister I'd once protected, the one I'd hoped might understand, was nowhere to be found in that moment. Over the next few days, the story began to ripple through the town like a quiet storm. People I hadn't spoken to in years reached out, not with judgment or gossip, but with concern and curiosity. A few family friends admitted they'd long suspected there was more beneath the surface than the picture-perfect family I'd left behind. Others apologized for never speaking up. At first, my parents tried to maintain control, holding private meetings, sending messages to close relatives to downplay the situation. But the carefully built facade was cracking, and there was no putting the pieces back exactly the way they were. As the weeks passed, things slowly started to change. My mother began seeing a therapist. It was hard for her at first, more pride than pain, but she showed up, and that was something. I could see her wrestling with the walls she'd built around herself, and even if she didn't say it aloud, I could tell she was beginning to understand the cost of silence. My father kept his distance, but there were moments when his guard slipped. A phone call here, a quiet apology there. I'm not sure if he ever fully grasped how much had been lost, but he was trying in his own way. Nolan and I talked more than we had in years. We shared stories, frustrations, and, finally, hopes. We acknowledged the years we'd wasted holding grudges and the distance that wasn't really about geography but about unspoken pain. Brynn and I took longer to rebuild trust. She was still wrapped up in the life they'd all crafted together, and I was the outsider who had dared to pull the curtain back. Our conversations were cautious, sometimes awkward, but we met halfway. Slowly, she started to see me not as a problem, but as a person. Meanwhile, the family gatherings changed too. They weren't perfect, far from it. There were still moments of tension and old patterns trying to reassert themselves. But the silence that had once defined us was gone. We were forced to talk, to listen, to confront. And me? I finally felt like I had a voice. The problem child label never fit, and I no longer let it define me. I had stepped away from a story that was never mine to tell and started writing my own, on my own terms. Looking back now, I realized that the real problem was never me. It was a family afraid to admit its flaws, unwilling to see the cracks beneath the polished surface. Breaking that silence was hard, painful, and messy, but it was the only way we could ever begin to heal. So yes, I walked away from that party. I walked away from the expectations, the labels, and the roles they'd written for me. But I didn't walk away from my family completely. I just made sure they saw me clearly, not as the problem child, but as Eva. Someone who deserved to be heard. Someone who deserved to be loved. And that made all the difference.